Meet Hawa. She's 34 years old. She's a seamstress in Osogbo, Osun State. She woke up at 5:30 in the morning on Saturday, August 15, 2026 to prepare for the Osun governorship election. She had her permanent voter card in her bag. She wore her hijab as she does every day, as she has done since she was a teenager. She walked 40 minutes to her polling unit. She waited in the queue. When she got to the accreditation point, the account of what happened next, as documented by MURIC, the Muslim Rights Concern Organization, is that she was stopped, told she could not be verified with her face covered. She explained, she asked. According to the account that was filed and published the following day, she was turned away. Hawa did not vote in the Osun 2026 governorship election, an election that, as it turned out, was won by a margin of votes that, in at least some polling units, may have been smaller than the number of Muslim women in hijab who were allegedly denied access. MURIC says it has video evidence. INEC says the allegations are under review. The INEC chairman, Professor Joash Amupitan, is now facing simultaneous calls for his removal from the Muslim Rights Concern, from the African Democratic Congress, from the Movement for Credible Elections, and from Nigerian diaspora groups who protested outside the UK Parliament 3 months ago. And the January 16, 2027 presidential election is 5 months away. Here is the question that should concern every Nigerian voter, whether you are APC, NDC, ADC, or undecided. If INEC could not run a governorship election in one state on August 15 without a credibility controversy that generated national outrage by August 16, is the Commission genuinely ready to run a presidential election across 36 states and the FCT in January? Before we go deeper, if you're just finding Niger News Watch, welcome. This channel exists to break down what's really happening in Nigerian politics without the noise and without the spin. If that's the kind of analysis you enjoy, hit subscribe and stay with me because this story is about to get a lot more interesting. Let me take you through the full picture of why INEC's credibility is a live crisis, not a theoretical concern as Nigeria heads into 2027. The story starts with Professor Joash Amupitan, who was appointed INEC chairman in late 2024 by President Tinubu. Amupitan is a lawyer and academic from Kogi State. His background is non-partisan in the formal sense, no registered party membership, no known campaign involvement. But shortly after his appointment, a set of social media posts were circulated, allegedly from accounts linked to him before his appointment, which appeared to show support for the APC and for President Tinubu. INEC dismissed the posts as fabricated. Opposition parties said they were real. In April 2026, the controversy sharpened into an institutional confrontation. The ADC, Atiku's party, staged the protest at INEC's Abuja headquarters. ADC National Chairman David Mark publicly declared that his party had lost confidence in INEC's neutrality. He accused the Commission of acting unlawfully by taking sides in the ADC's internal leadership dispute, recognizing and then de-recognizing the Mark-led NEC in what he described as politically motivated interventions. INEC fired back, calling the calls for Amupitan's removal a direct assault on his constitutional independence. By April 21st, protests had spread. Nigerians staged demonstrations outside the UK Parliament in London, diaspora groups calling for Amupitan's removal. The Movement for Credible Elections issued a statement saying INEC was at a democratic crossroads and that Nigeria's credibility ahead of 2027 was at threat. INEC cleared its chairman of all allegations and accused opposition parties of trying to undermine the electoral umpire for selfish political purposes. Then came the tests that would either confirm or disprove the credibility concerns. 2 off-cycle governorship elections, Ekiti State in June 2026 and Osun State on August 15, 2026, 3 days ago. These were INEC's real field examinations under Amupitan. The Ekiti election passed with relatively limited controversy. The Osun election, which INEC declared won by the incumbent APC Governor Adeleke, generated immediate and serious allegations the following day. MURIC, the Muslim Rights Concern, published a statement on August 16, 2026, accusing INEC of allowing the widespread barring of Muslim women from voting across multiple Osun polling units. MURIC said it had video evidence of at least one woman who documented her experience of being denied the right to vote because of her dress. MURIC called for Amupitan's immediate removal. INEC said the allegations were under review. That is where we are today, August 18, 2026. 5 months before the presidential election, INEC is running two simultaneous crises: the institutional credibility question about its chairman's impartiality and the operational credibility question about whether it can manage the access and accreditation process fairly at 176,000 polling units across a country this diverse. And the answer to both questions will determine whether Nigerians trust the result on January 16. Let me show you the actual rules of the game, the legal framework that governs INEC, its chairman, and the conduct of the 2027 election, because understanding the rules is what allows you to identify where they are being tested. Rule 1, Section 153 and the constitutional independence of INEC. INEC is established as an independent federal executive body under Section 153 of the 1999 Constitution. Its independence is meant to insulate it from partisan interference. It cannot be directed by the President, the National Assembly, or any political party on how to conduct elections. This independence is the foundation of electoral credibility. But independence is a structural guarantee, not a human one. A constitutionally independent commission can still have a leader who is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as partisan, and perceptions of partisanship matter for voter confidence, regardless of what the legal structure says. For Hawaii Osogbo, the constitutional independence of INEC means nothing if the presiding officer at her polling unit denies her access in a way that is never formally adjudicated. Rule 2, Section 157 and the impossibility of removing the INEC chairman through pressure. Section 157 subclause 2 of the Constitution says the INEC chairman can only be removed by the President acting on a resolution supported by 2/3 of the Senate. There is no petition process, no civil society mechanism, no court order that can compel his removal without that constitutional pathway being followed. The President, who appointed him, would have to initiate the process, and the Senate, where the APC has 87 of 109 seats, would have to support it with a 2/3 majority. Those two conditions will not be met by political pressure alone. Understanding this rule is important because it means the credibility battle is not being fought over whether Amupitan stays or goes. It is being fought over whether, under his leadership, INEC can demonstrate enough operational integrity that the losing side accepts the result in January 2027. Rule 3, the Electoral Act 2026 and the Section 60 subclause 3 loophole. We covered this law in an earlier video, but let me refresh it in the context of INEC's readiness. The Electoral Act 2026 mandates electronic transmission of election results through the BVAS to INEC's IREF portal. Form EC8A, the results sheet signed at each polling unit, is now legally admissible as evidence in election tribunals. These are genuine improvements from 2022. But Section 60 subclause 3 gives presiding officers the discretionary right to use manual transmission if they determine there is a communication failure. That determination is at individual discretion. The law does not define what constitutes a failure. It does not require documentation. It does not specify verification. At 176,000 polling units across Nigeria, 176,000 individual presiding officers each have the personal authority to decide whether to use electronic or manual transmission. The PLAC fact sheet from March 2026 specifically flagged that INEC's CAN-table adopted much earlier administrative sequencing than the law strictly requires, which is a sign of operational seriousness. But the discretionary loophole in the results management chain remains the most significant legal vulnerability in the 2027 election framework. Rule 4, the voter registration closure and who it leaves out. INEC closed the continuous voter registration exercise on July 26, 2026, 90 days before the presidential election, as required by the new Electoral Act. This is legally correct, but the ADC publicly argued that the closure was premature and that millions of eligible Nigerians who did not complete registration in time will be excluded from the 2027 presidential vote. The SDP also said that while the closure was necessary, registration should ideally never have a final deadline in a modern democracy with digital NIN infrastructure. INEC responded that it could only account for citizens who presented themselves. The legal question is settled. The democratic question, how many eligible Nigerians have been shut out of the 2027 election by a registration window that closed before they participated, is not settled, and the number is unknown.
The gray area being navigated right now, in real time, is whether INEC's operational conduct in the Osun 2026 election, and specifically the hijab controversy, constitutes a violation of the right to vote under Section 39(1) and Section 77 of the Constitution, which protect the right of every qualified person to vote. INEC says the allegations are under review. MURIC says it has video evidence. That gap between allegation and investigation is where electoral credibility either holds or collapses. Now let us follow the money and the power, because the INEC credibility story is not just about one chairman or one election. It's about the structural conditions under which Nigeria's most consequential presidential election in a generation will be administered. And there are several players whose interests are directly served by different outcomes from this credibility debate. Start with who benefits from an INEC perceived as compromised. If significant portions of the Nigerian electorate, particularly opposition-leaning voters, come to believe that INEC is not neutral before the election happens, two things follow. First, some voters stay home. Why queue for 2 hours to vote if you believe the result is already decided? Voter apathy driven by pre-election distrust is not the same as voter apathy driven by political indifference. It's a motivated disengagement, and it disproportionately affects the educated, urban, opposition-leaning voter who has the
clearest alternative comparison and the sharpest sense that the system is rigged. Second, losing parties have a ready-made legitimacy framework for challenging the result. If INEC's credibility is already contested before the election, the post-election period, which in Nigeria has historically produced tribunal battles lasting months, begins with the narrative already established that the umpire was not neutral. The incumbent benefits from both effects: less motivated opposition turnout and the weakened post-election legitimacy framework for challengers. The social media posts allegation and what it actually means. The alleged pro-Tinubu social media posts linked to Amupitan are not proven forgeries and not proven authentic. INEC has rejected them, but even in the absence of definitive proof, the allegation has done political work. It introduced the question of partisanship at the moment of appointment, the very moment when an electoral commission chairman needs maximum public credibility to function effectively. The question that the allegation creates does not require proof to have effect. It requires only that the question remain unresolved, and it has remained unresolved for months. INEC's response, that the allegations are politically motivated, may be correct, but a denial is not a demonstration. What would have demonstrated neutrality was a transparent, independent review of the posts that conclusively determined their authenticity or lack thereof. That review did not happen. The allegation therefore continues to circulate in the political information space as a live credibility risk. The Osun 2026 election as a dry run and what it revealed. The Osun governorship election on August 15, 2026 was the most important operational test INEC has had under Amupitan's leadership. INEC conducted a mock accreditation exercise on August 1 to test BVAS readiness. The official result was declared, the incumbent Adeleke winning. But the allegation that hijab-wearing Muslim women were systematically denied access at polling units across Osun State arrives with a specific political weight that goes beyond the Osun election itself. Osun's electorate is significantly Muslim. If Muslim women were denied the vote in a state with a Muslim majority population, the question of how INEC will manage accreditation for Muslim women in Kano, Sokoto, Jigawa, Kebbi, Zamfara, Katsina, and Borno, all northern states with overwhelming Muslim populations, becomes urgent in the context of January 2027. A mistake in Osun at small scale is a manageable controversy. The same mistake replicated across 17 northern states would be an electoral catastrophe. The vote buying and money dimension. INEC Chairman Amupitan himself acknowledged in his April 9 remarks that the 2027 election battle would largely be fought in the information space. But civil society group Kappa has raised a separate concern: the growing influence of money in Nigeria's electoral process. Vote buying and the dominance of wealthy political actors, Kappa warned, pose a serious threat to credible elections. This is not a new problem in Nigerian elections, but it is sharper in 2027 for a specific reason. The APC controls 31 state governments and the enormous patronage networks that come with that control. The opposition parties NDC, ADC, APM, SDP do not have the financial resources of the ruling party's state apparatuses. If vote buying is a significant factor in 2027 and INEC's enforcement capacity under the new Electoral Act campaign finance provisions is weak, the financial asymmetry between the ruling party and the opposition is multiplied by an electoral process that cannot effectively police it. INEC's media regulations, equal airtime, 24-hour blackout, penalties up to 5 million naira for violations are written into the law. Whether they are enforced is a different question. The voter register revalidation and the exclusion fear. INEC announced a nationwide voter register revalidation exercise intended to clean the register by removing deceased voters, eliminating multiple registrations, and verifying active voter status. INEC stated clearly that the exercise predates Amupitan's appointment and is purely administrative, but the opposition's concern is structural. A revalidation exercise that happens closer to an election removes the agency of challenged voters to seek remedy in time. If your name is removed from the register through the revalidation process incorrectly, you have very little time to identify the error, contact INEC, get it corrected, and appear at your polling unit on election day with a valid registration. At scale, a revalidation exercise with even a small error rate produces thousands of disenfranchised voters, and the question of which communities are more vulnerable to that error, communities with weaker infrastructure for following up bureaucratic processes, is a democratic justice question that INEC has not fully addressed publicly. And here is the pattern interrupt that reframes everything about this story. The 2023 election was widely criticized for IREV data and the gap between what electronic transmission showed and what returning officers announced. The entire Electoral Act 2026 reform, the mandate for IREV upload, the legal admissibility of Form EC8A, was designed to close that gap. But now, in August 2026, the body responsible for implementing those reforms is being questioned on three simultaneous fronts: its chairman's impartiality, its ability to manage religious inclusivity in voter accreditation, and the adequacy of its voter register. All three challenges existed before Amupitan. All three are now being tested under him, and they are all being tested 5 months before January 16, 2027. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. Let me bring this back to Hawa, walking 40 minutes to her polling unit in Osogbo and being turned away. For Hawa, the credibility of INEC is not an abstract institutional question. It is a very concrete one. She had her PVC, she arrived early, she waited in the queue, and if the account of what happened is accurate, if she was denied the vote because of her hijab, then the elaborate institutional machinery that INEC represents failed at its most basic function, letting a qualified citizen cast her vote. That failure does not require a compromised chairman to explain it. It requires only undertrained polling staff, unclear guidelines, or poorly communicated protocols at the polling unit level. And at 176,000 polling units across Nigeria, the gap between what INEC chairman says in Abuja and what the presiding officer does at a polling unit in Osogbo is enormous. Closing that gap is not a political problem. It is an operational and training problem, and it is one of the most important questions about whether Nigeria is genuinely ready for January 2027. For ordinary Nigerians watching this across the country, in Lagos, in Kano, in Maiduguri, in Enugu, the Hawa story is the question made personal. Will my vote count? Will I be allowed to vote? Will the result I see at my polling unit match the result that is announced? Will the system, if it fails me, have any recourse that is faster than a tribunal process that takes 6 months to resolve? The economic consequence of an election whose credibility is contested is real, and post-election instability, whether legal disputes, mass protests, or simply a prolonged uncertainty about who legitimately won, affects business confidence, foreign investment decisions, naira stability, and the government's ability to execute its economic program. A clean, accepted result on January 16 is not just a democratic requirement, it is an economic necessity. The cost of a contested result in legal proceedings, in political disruption, in investor uncertainty is a cost that ordinary Nigerians will pay in their daily lives.
The international dimension of INEC's credibility crisis is real and has already produced physical demonstrations outside Nigeria's borders. In April 2026, Nigerians in the diaspora staged a protest outside the UK Parliament, specifically calling for Amupitan's removal over concerns about INEC's neutrality ahead of 2027. This is unusual. Diaspora protests outside foreign parliaments over the conduct of a domestic electoral commission signals that the credibility concern has crossed into international political space and that Nigerians abroad are watching the 2027 election with the same scrutiny they brought to 2023 when many of them returned home to vote for the first time. International election observer missions from the EU, the African Union, the Commonwealth, and the National Democratic Institute are already in pre-assessment mode for Nigeria's 2027 election. The Osun 2026 election controversy, arriving just 3 days before this script was written, will be noted in every pre-election assessment report that these missions are preparing. How INEC responds to MURIC's allegations, whether it conducts a transparent, independent investigation or dismisses them as politically motivated, will itself become data for those assessments. For Nigerian investors and international businesses with operations in Nigeria, the credibility of the 2027 election is a risk variable. A clean, accepted result reduces political risk and allows both the incoming or re-elected government to execute its economic program with a clear mandate. A contested result, disputed in courts, challenged by losing parties, or rejected by segments of the public as fraudulent, introduces the kind of political uncertainty that delays investment decisions and raises the cost of doing business in Nigeria for the entire post-election period. Let me be direct about the strongest arguments in INEC's defense, because this channel does not do partisan analysis. The credibility concerns are real, but so is the case that INEC under Amupitan has been more operationally serious than its critics acknowledge. The case for INEC's operational seriousness is not empty. Professor Amupitan published the 2027 election timetable on February 13, 2026, earlier than legally required, giving stakeholders more lead time than any previous INEC timetable. Campaign filing of candidate forms was set to open and close earlier than the law strictly requires, as PLAC's fact sheet confirmed. The continuous voter registration portal was operational and included online and physical registration options in all 774 LGAs.
The Akiti governorship election in June 2026 passed without major credibility controversies. The mock accreditation exercise on August 1, 2026, testing BVAS ahead of Osun, is exactly the kind of operational dry run that INEC should be running. And Amupitan personally called on media organizations and civil society to help combat rising voter apathy, acknowledging the problem publicly rather than minimizing it. These are the actions of a commission that is taking its 2027 mandate seriously. The strongest specific defense of Amupitan's independence, the ADC derecognition sequence. The ADC accused INEC of partisanship for derecognizing the David Mark-led NEC during the party's leadership dispute, but INEC's response on this was specific. The commission acted on a court order at each stage of the ADC leadership dispute. When courts told INEC to recognize the Mark NEC, it did. When a court ruling changed that position, INEC updated its recognition accordingly. INEC said plainly, INEC didn't make the decision that is causing these grievances, pointing to court orders as the source of each contested action. If INEC was following court orders, the accusation of partisanship on the ADC matter is an accusation against the courts, not against INEC. The Court of Appeal, which ultimately restored the ADC status, was not accusing INEC of partisanship. It was overturning a lower court. INEC's conduct in following court orders is constitutionally appropriate, even if the underlying court decisions were controversial. But here is where INEC's defense falls short on the Hawa question. INEC's operational conduct at the presidential level, timetable design, registration infrastructure, technology deployment may be commendable. What is not addressed by any of that commendable conduct is what happens at polling unit level in a specific community when a presiding officer who has not been adequately trained or briefed makes a decision that denies a qualified voter access to the ballot. INEC's constitutional independence and its chairman's academic credentials and legal pedigree are entirely irrelevant to Hawa at the accreditation point in Osogbo. What is relevant is the quality of the instruction that presiding officer received, the training they underwent, and the protocol they were given for managing voters in religious dress. If INEC cannot demonstrate that it has a clear, uniform, communicated protocol for this specific situation and that it enforced it in Osun, then the Hawa controversy will follow INEC into January 2027 and multiply. The biggest misconception in the opposition's critique of INEC is that Amupitan's removal would solve the credibility problem. It would not. The structural vulnerabilities in Nigeria's 2027 electoral framework, the Section 60 Subscript 3 discretionary loophole, the vote-buying environment, the voter register quality, the training gap at polling unit level existed before Amupitan and would exist after him. Removing the chairman does not close the Section 60 Subscript 3 loophole. It does not train 176,000 presiding officers better. It does not reduce the financial asymmetry between the ruling party and opposition candidates. The credibility problem is institutional, not personal, and the solution is institutional, not personal. The opposition parties demanding Amupitan's removal would achieve more by engaging constructively on the INEC regulation of the Section 60 Subscript 3 loophole, by deploying trained polling unit agents in large numbers, and by building the kind of results protection infrastructure that the 2026 Electoral Act now makes possible. Let me give you the 4 signals to watch between now and December 2026 that will tell you whether INEC's credibility crisis is being resolved or whether Nigeria is heading into January 2027 with the umpire's impartiality still in serious dispute. Signal 1. INEC's formal response to the Osun hijab allegations. MURIC says it has video evidence. INEC says the allegations are under review. Watch whether INEC publishes a formal investigation outcome in the next 2 to 4 weeks, one that either confirms the incidents did not happen as alleged or acknowledges that some polling officials acted improperly and outlines the corrective steps being taken. A transparent, public investigation outcome that takes the allegations seriously, even if it ultimately finds the facts do not support MURIC's account, demonstrates operational accountability. A dismissal without investigation or a prolonged silence confirms the narrative that INEC does not engage seriously with credibility challenges. Given that Muslim-majority states make up the bulk of the North's voter population heading into January, this specific operational question cannot be left unresolved before presidential campaigns intensify. Signal 2. Whether INEC publishes implementing regulations for Section 60 Subscript 3. We covered this in our political map video. The discretionary exception in the electronic transmission provision of the Electoral Act 2026 is the most significant legal vulnerability in the results management framework. INEC has the authority to publish binding operational guidelines that define what constitutes a communication failure, require documentation, and specify verification procedures at polling unit level. If INEC publishes such guidelines before the candidate filing deadline closes, making the Section 60 Subscript 3 exception narrow and procedurally constrained, it demonstrates that the Commission is taking seriously the accountability gap that the loophole creates. If no such guidelines appear before November, the loophole remains as wide as it was when the law was signed. Signal 3. The quality of polling unit agent training by October. The mock accreditation exercise before Osun was a positive operational signal. Watch whether INEC announces and executes a comprehensive polling unit officer training program before October 2026, one that specifically addresses religious dress, voter access protocols, and the uniform application of accreditation procedures. Credible reports from civil society organizations that monitor INEC's operational readiness, Yaga Africa, CIPP, the Electoral Reform Network, should be watched for assessments of the training quality. If those organizations report that training is substantive and nationwide, INEC's operational credibility improves. If they report inadequate coverage, the Hawa scenario is at risk of replication at presidential election scale. Final candidate filing completion and the final candidate list. INEC set the candidate filing portal closure for presidential and National Assembly elections at July 11, 2026, though formal submission continues until August 29th. The final list of candidates is due to be published on August 15, 2026. Watch whether any candidate's name is excluded from that list in circumstances that generate legal challenge, particularly whether any opposition candidate's paperwork is rejected on technical grounds that other observers consider pretextual. Candidate exclusion controversies in the filing period are a classic signal of electoral manipulation. Any such controversy involving a presidential or high-profile senatorial candidate becomes a credibility crisis that INEC will have to navigate while simultaneously managing the operational demands of the campaign period. Best-case scenario for Nigerian democracy. INEC publishes a transparent investigation into the Osun hijab allegations, takes corrective action, and issues clear voter access protocols ahead of January. Section 60 Subscript 3 regulations are published, and civil society confirms they meaningfully constrain the discretionary loophole. Polling unit training is substantive and nationwide. The final candidate list is published without major exclusion controversies. Campaign period conduct is monitored effectively under the Electoral Act's media provisions.
On January 16, 2027, electronic transmission covers a high enough fraction of polling units that the result announced is verifiable against IREV data. The losing side accepts the result or challenges it through tribunals, not through mass street protest. Nigerian democracy is strengthened by a conducted election that, even if imperfect, was clearly administered in good faith. Worst-case scenario for Nigerian democracy. The Osun hijab allegations are never formally investigated or are dismissed without substantive review. Section 60 Subscript 3 regulations are not published, leaving the discretionary loophole fully operational. Polling unit training is inadequate and uneven across states. On January 16th, widespread accreditation problems in northern states generate same-day social media controversy. Electronic transmission is interrupted at significant numbers of polling units through claimed communication failures, and manual results sheets produced by returning officers diverge from what IREV records. The losing presidential candidate refuses to accept the result. Street protests erupt in major cities. The post-election tribunal process, which under Nigerian law can take up to 180 days, becomes the de facto resolution mechanism for a disputed result. Nigeria enters 2027 with a government whose mandate is contested by tens of millions of voters. The economic and social costs of that scenario are severe. The long-term consequence of an INEC that fails to resolve its credibility crisis before January, voter apathy deepens, particularly among the educated urban professional class that powered the obedient movement in 2023 and that is already calculating whether the JAPA option is more rational than continued civic investment. A generation of first-time voters who queued in 2023 and watched the result disputed in courts will have no incentive to queue in 2027 if they believe the result is predetermined, and the democratic compact that requires losers to accept results and winners to govern within constitutional limits begins to dissolve. That is not just Nigeria's problem, it's a test of whether democratic governance is viable in Africa's most populous country. Let me take you back to Hawa in Oshogbo, walking 40 minutes to a polling unit that, if the allegation is confirmed, turned her away. The question I asked at the beginning of this video was whether INEC is genuinely ready to run a presidential election across 36 states in January 2027, given that a governorship election in one state 3 days ago generated a credibility controversy that was national news by the following morning. Here is my honest answer. INEC is operationally more prepared than it was in 2023 in some measurable ways. The timetable is out early, the Electoral Act 2026 is an improvement on 2022, BVAS has been tested in mock exercises, the IRF portal is now legally recognized. These are real preparations. But operational preparation is not the same as operational credibility, and credibility requires two things that INEC has not yet demonstrated. First, it requires that the Commission's chairman be perceived as impartial by all significant stakeholders, not just the ruling party's allies, but the opposition parties, civil society, and ordinary voters, whose confidence in the process is what makes a result legitimate. Second, it requires that what is designed in Abuja actually functions at the polling unit in Oshogbo, in Hawa's ward, at her accreditation point, in the hands of the presiding officer who will decide whether her vote counts. On both those tests, INEC's status in August 2026 is incomplete, not failed, but incomplete. The Osun election has given INEC a specific, documented challenge to address. How it addresses that challenge in the next 60 days will tell Nigeria more about whether January 16, 2027 will be a credible election than any press statement or campaign timetable announcement. Hawa is watching. Every voter who heard her story is watching, and if INEC cannot account for what happened at her polling unit in Oshogbo on August 15th,
cannot investigate it transparently and communicate the outcome clearly, the question of whether Nigeria is ready for January 2027 will answer itself. Tell me, do you think INEC is ready, and what should it do differently in the next 5 months to earn back public trust? Drop your answer in the comments. This one matters. If this breakdown gave you clarity on what's really going on, do me a favor, share it with one person who needs to understand this. Like the video, subscribe to Niger News Watch, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp.